Very excited, everyone. Thanks for joining the call here with David Thomas. David's a great professional friend, known him for many years through the Independent Educational Consultants Association. Just has a tremendous background in educational consulting, covers a lot of areas, but med school admissions is one of the strong areas. And I know we have such a unique group of aspiring medical students and future doctors in this group. I thought it'd be a really great gesture for all the clients, because this is truly a specialized knowledge of educational consulting. And David's experience over 15 years with this, has a bachelor's, as we talked about, from the University of Texas Austin, and a Master of Science in Journalism from Northwestern. So he's worked with clients all throughout the country and the world. Very importantly, he's gotten students into a whole cross-section of colleges, from the most selective, Ivies, everything in between. Just has an extensive knowledge of this. I did see David's slides, really great information. So without further ado, I will turn things over to David. Thank you again.
Hey guys, thank you so much for listening. The fact is, of course, that medical school admissions is nothing like college admissions. And unlike, say, law school admissions, which is actually quite similar, just like a little higher level of sophistication, medical school admissions, sometimes what you should do for college admissions is the opposite of what you should do for medical school. So unfortunately, this is not a practice run. It's a whole new game you're going to play. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I've got a little slideshow here. I'm going to zip through the first slides, but there's some really important foundational stuff you need to understand, or some of the later stuff won't make sense. And Jason is going to distribute this PDF, so you don't have to worry about writing down the huge amount of information I'm about to blast at you from a fire hose. But I do need to get through it first. So, you know, it's so common. What is the best college for pre-med? You may be fortunate enough to have, you know, several offers and maybe some more coming down the pike, and you're not sure which one's the best one to take. So which one as a pre-med should you take? But that is not the right question to ask, actually. And I'm going to tell you what the right ones are, but some of the most common questions: where can I find a list of strong pre-meds? Or is this a good school for a pre-med? What should my pre-med student major in? Or this school doesn't have good admission statistics for med schools, and that creates some concern. Those are actually red herrings. So I'm going to talk about what the smartest way to frame the right questions and the right questions to ask, right? Now, one of my favorite ways to work is to make really bold, black and white statements, and then sort of color in between the lines and add some nuance later. So I'm going to make a few really bold statements that do need nuance, but college major doesn't matter. And where you go to college doesn't matter. Rigor doesn't matter in med school admissions as much as it does in college. In other words, honors classes aren't inherently better than regular classes, for example. Taking classes beyond the pre-med prerequisites don't really matter, big asterisk, but there are some courses that can help with that. High school activities, all the stuff you've done to get into the college you're into, cannot be included in a med school app, so you're starting from scratch. So one of the things in choosing a college you want to think about is how many resources you're going to have to build from scratch, a blank resume for medical school. And then finally, this last one, medical school rankings don't matter. So your college doesn't matter. We're going to find out what that really means later. But at the end of the day, faculty for med school, what they care about is how passionately you want to be a doctor. Okay. And what have you done to prove that? And, you know, famously, to be a doctor, whether you went to Harvard or whether you went to Albany or whether you went to a local satellite school at a DO program, you have to pass the exact same boards, certifications, licensing requirements. And at the end of the day, the idea of like rank of a medical school is really not very important. One of my students who went to UC, to Colorado, University of Colorado by the medical school, just got the #1 placement for residency in urology at the Mayo Clinic. which is, of course, one of the best clinics in the world. And she didn't have to go to an Ivy League med school to get that placement at Mayo. All right. So moving on. What is a pre-med major? Well, there is really no such thing. There are a few schools that actually have a major called pre-med or pre-dent or something like that. But it doesn't matter what you major in if you want to be a doctor. What matters is that you take a collection of coursework that I've put right here. Again, you'll get these slides. You don't need to write all this down, but you need a year of bio, a year of gen chem, a year of orgo, a year of physics, a year of math, a year of English, and then you really, 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 really need to take a class called biochemistry, even though medical schools don't require it. But the MCAT has biochem all over it. All right. And then, huge note, do not use AP credits to fulfill any of your requirements unless you're willing to limit your med school list. A lot of med schools do not accept AP credits to fulfill these requirements. Actually, I wouldn't say a lot, but certainly enough that it could really put a dent in your expected school list. And if you have an AP credit in bio or chemistry, just take the same class over in college and make an easy A. Because trust me, you need a high, you want as close to a 4.0 GPA as you can get in college on these classes. These particular list of required classes are called BCPM courses. Most people think of them as the science GPA. However, there are a lot of science classes that do not count towards the BCPM GPA. So the actual medical schools don't talk about science GPA. They talk about your BCPM GPA. And you can see BCPM stands for biology, chemistry, physics, math, period, the end, right? Now, AP credits. So let's say that you're one of the universities you're considering allows you, if you have an AP Chem credit, for example, that you could go into a higher level of chemistry, or you could just retake the same class. I advise you to retake the same class, okay? Make the easy A. Unless chemistry is a passion of yours, you love chemistry, and you as an individual want that higher challenge and higher level of rigor, and you're bored with the chemistry you already know, then take the higher level, but take it because you want it. Don't take it because it's going to look better. It is not going to look better to medical schools, right? Now, moving on. So what does a pre-med need, right? You're going to need clinical exposure. You're going to need research. You're going to need service to others, shadowing, leadership, and exposure to diversity, people of different socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, cultural backgrounds, because doctors can't choose their patients. I'm going to explain what a little of these mean, but one little note, what is the difference between shadowing and clinical exposure? Shadowing is when your focus is on the doctor and the lifestyle of the doctor. Clinical exposure or clinical work, whether it's paid or volunteer, is exposure to patients. Now, when you're shadowing a doctor, you're probably going to see the doctor interacting with patients. But the purpose of shadowing is to understand that the daily motion of being a doctor, the lifestyle of being a doctor, is something you enjoy and want. On the other hand, the point of clinical exposure is to make sure that interacting with sick people who sometimes are feeling very fearful, anxious, upset, and they like to take that out or don't know better than to take that out on the first person next to them, and that's you, because you're wheeling them in a wheelchair to the x-ray as a volunteer, and they're yelling at you the whole time. You're like, why are you treating me like this? You know, and you have to understand that as a doctor or as a clinician, you are often subject to the fears and anxieties of patients, and you have to be able to let that just go and not take it personally. And you don't get that with shadowing. You do get it with clinical exposure, right? So you can get all of these things that I just mentioned in this list at any type of college or university. However, it's easier for some than others. So setting is crucial. Should you be at a big, huge research institution, a tiny little liberal arts college, somewhere in between? Well, and I'm sure Jason has talked to all of you about college fit, and you might have a variety of options, but I want to talk about some of the pros and cons of these different types of institutions. These are not inherent pros and cons, they're inherent facts. And whether those facts are for you specifically a pro or a con really depends on your own personality, your values, things like that, okay? So a little bit of definitions, clinical exposure, and as I said, in shadowing, we just talked about that. Research is traditional lab work. Like think of a person in a white coat looking at a slide. That's called bench research. Sometimes it's called wet research or wet lab research, right? Clinical research is research that's really based directly on how effective a treatment might be. Like if you're trying to decide if a particular vaccine is going to make people sick or not, that's clinical research. But how the actual molecules work to create immunity, that is bench research. Medical schools prefer bench research. And if you want to get into like an Ivy or like a top tier research medical school, you need to really focus on bench. Please don't focus on clinical. If you want to be a clinician and be more of a person-based doctor, there's a whole different type of medical school for that, and clinical research is good. Now, and then service, of course, is just community engagement. That's not medical. Don't only do medical things when you're a pre-med. Okay, they want to see that you just care about your community or other communities. So now that we know what these words mean, let's talk about the pros and cons for universities and liberal arts colleges. Universities, think about it like this. Let's say you are a neuroscience major, and universities might have 30 different studies in neuroscience. A liberal arts college might only have 4 studies in neuroscience. So the universities are giving you a lot more choice, a lot more options. The problem, on the other hand, is that at a university, the PhD candidates get first choice, and then the master's candidates get second choice, and then the seniors, and then the juniors, and the sophomores, and finally the freshmen get choices for those projects at universities. So you might have lots of options at a university, but you were frozen out of those options as an undergrad. So liberal arts colleges or smaller universities sometimes can give you much greater access to faculty and research opportunities. Also think about recommendations. Recommendations are very, very important in applying to medical school. And you need at least 2 BCPM, I'm not going to say science, you need at least 2 BCPM professors. So let's say you're an electrical engineering major, they won't accept an electrical engineering recommendation, right? You have to have biology, physics, math, or chemistry. So if you, in the smaller schools, it's easier to create relationships with faculty. In a university, you might have 600 people in a class, each one has 10 TAs with 60 people per group. And the TA is really the person you're dealing with. Now, there's a really great hack, by the way, for how to deal with that problem. So this is a very solvable problem at a university, but it is something to think about. Who most needs to worry about that, though? If you are a very shy person, if you're very awkward about asking for help, if it's hard for you to make to put yourself out there and get to know the faculty and go to office hours and go to coffees and do all that, sometimes you might get squeezed out of the way. And the more aggressive students, the ones with the sharp elbows, they're the ones like jumping the line to the front and cornering the professor and getting the great relationships in these 500 people classes. So if you're a person who's much more reserved, it might be better to go to a smaller university or a liberal arts college to develop relationships with faculty, which are especially incredibly important. Now, on the other hand, so liberal arts colleges really have the edge in that particular regard. Universities have the edge in another way, though. Universities, especially the larger ones, like think a school like Penn State, right? Penn State is such an enormous institution that it's surrounded by hospitals, doctors' offices, private practices, research labs. I mean, gosh, Pittsburgh has probably got more research labs per capita than any city, but maybe Boston. You know, fantastic place. That's why University of Pittsburgh is such an incredible medical school and university for a pre-med. And if you're at Kenyon College in Ohio, medical schools love kids from Kenyon College. However, it's going to be harder for you to find access to opportunities outside of this small town and small university, especially for clinical volunteering. Now, you don't need a hospital next door to do that. You can volunteer at private practices, in free clinics, in any sort of environment. Medical schools just want you to have patient exposure. But the smaller towns, especially in rural areas, do have a more limited opportunity. On the other hand, if it were me, I would go probably to a liberal arts college, because when I was 17, I had a hard time talking to people and making connections, right? But my sister would have been the person to jump to the front of the line, right? She would have had no problem with that. So really, you have to think about what you're most comfortable with. Or you might just say, I need to develop that skill. I might be a little shyer now, but I need to get comfortable with jumping to the front of the line. And by the way, that would be a good skill to develop in college. Next, major. What should I major in? This is a huge question. This is probably the single question I get the most. And to be honest, I don't care what you major in, and neither does a medical school. Okay, here's what medical schools care about. Those classes right there on your screen right now. They care about those classes, how you did in those classes. Now, and then of course they want general excellence, and then they want all of that other stuff, you know, bench work, clinical volunteering, all that. The only majors I would ask you to avoid, except under very specific circumstances, are engineering or business or communications, majors that generally require that you spend your summers in a pre-professional environment doing internships in communications or business or engineering. Also, these sorts of classes tend to be, have a lot of group projects, a lot of externship, or maybe even co-op requirements. And that's pulling you away from all those pre-med prereqs that you need, right? Liberal arts, on average, tend to be much better pre-med. But what you don't need to be is a biology major. You don't need to be a chemistry major. Medical schools don't give any bonus points for that. Chemistry is the easiest thing to major in, and it's also the most common major for pre-med. But think about it, the biochem, a year of orgo, a year of gen chem, that's already 5 classes that all fit into the chemistry set, 5 out of 10, right? Just in one of those BCPM areas. So that's the easiest, but if you just look at the stats, like all the people who majored in chemistry, something like 13% of chemistry majors get into med school, 18% of biology majors get into med school, but 50% of philosophy majors get into med school. 52% of music majors get into med school, and classics is my favorite. Classics is the study of the ancient world, Greece and Rome in particular. And to be a classics major at most institutions, you have to take 2 years of Latin and 2 years of Greek, right? Now, what is all medical terminology based on? Latin and Greek. You know, when you look at words like osteomyelitis or the, matriculum, or, like all of those medical anatomical words are all based in Greek and Latin. So having some basic Greek and Latin gives you a huge leg up once you get to med school. Also, classics includes the study of mythology, sociology. It's got a lot of anthropology. It's the study of the human condition. And medical schools love when you understand humans, right? Like how people think, how they operate, what matters to people. And so, why do they like music? Well, think about it. You want to be a surgeon and you know how to pluck a guitar. Okay, you're developing incredible manual dexterity. Those are huge things. And by the way, if you want to apply to dental school, and a lot of pre-meds end up shifting to dentistry, you have to prove manual dexterity. Part of the big test is manual dexterity. You actually have to prove that you can thread a needle in order to do the test, right? One of my most successful students ever was a music major, and getting into into school is way beyond what you might have expected. But sciences, though, it stands that a lot of pre-meds love science, and science are their most comfortable subjects. Well, there's neuroscience, there's mathematics, there's kinesiology. Medicine is increasingly metrics driven and computer driven. And if you like computer science and that's something you're really interested in, think about it like this. In med school, you're going to be studying 4 years of intense medical science. And then you're going to be doing 4 years of a residency. And every single admissions faculty I've ever talked to have said, you're going to be doing 8 years after college, like 4 years of really intense medical science and another 4 years of intense medical clinical placement and practice in your specialty. So why do that in college? Why don't you try doing something different in college and expanding your mind and knowledge base in different ways? Because in medical school, they're going to teach you all the anatomy you need, all the physiology you need. You don't need to learn anatomy. Anatomy is not a required course. So study computer science or neuroscience, kinesiology. Public health is a really cool thing to study because while it is not a science, well, in the medical sense, it is the study of how populations stay healthy. It can be very interesting for you. But I would like to say, I just put this out in our public forum, Jason. You may remember this if you saw it, but last cycle, I had 5 people get into Harvard Medical School. One of them was a neuroscience major, but one of them was a fashion major. One of them was a public health major. One of them was, oh gosh, what was the other one? I just wrote this down, so now, of course, I'm on the spot. But only one of them was a traditional science major. The other 4 were not. Communications was, I believe, what it was. Now, so if you look at the actual number of people in a medical school, the majority of those people might be bio majors or chem majors, but that doesn't mean it doesn't mean that med schools prefer biology or chemistry. It just means that it goes without saying that people who want to be doctors are also more likely to major in things like chemistry or biology, but those are sort of basic majors. There's a phrase in science called correlation does not equal causation. You've probably all studied that in high school already. And so looking at the data for medical school admissions, you always have to keep in mind that correlation does not equal causation, because there are a lot of instances of that. So I'm going to move on. Quick question. Do med schools prefer their own undergrads? No. Well, there's some prefer them a little bit, but it can seem that way if you look at the data. This is a great example again of correlation doesn't equal causation. things like state residency, geographic proximity, existing community ties, these things do matter to medical schools. And if you are an undergrad at that school, then you already have at least geographic proximity and existing community ties. Therefore, you are more likely to get into that medical school for those reasons. But it appears as if Duke likes Duke undergrads, or Wake likes Wake undergrads, or Penn State, or Penn likes Penn undergrad. No, it's actually really not that. So don't choose your college because it has a great med school. All right, you are not more likely to get into that med school if you go to that college. For just the name of the brand, right? Now, if your college has a great med school, that might mean that that college has an excellent medical faculty right down the road, great research opportunities, and a teaching hospital. So there are resources that medical school could offer you, but don't just do it on the brand. Tulane doesn't like Tulane undergrads more than it likes other undergrads. Moving on. So what questions should you ask when considering a college? Okay, this first bullet, I could literally talk for an hour just on this subject. But first, most important question to ask, does the college have a pre-med committee or pre-health advising? Your college is going to have one or the other, okay? If you are very confident that you are going to be in the top cohort of your, that you are going to be in the top group of people in your college as a pre-med, then, and you have a choice between two colleges, one that has a committee and one that doesn't, maybe choose the school with a committee, all right? However, I am not a big fan of pre-med committees. Pre-med committees have a lot of downsides to them. But if you're a really good rule follower, you're a really proactive person, and you are confident that you're going to be at the top of your game, a pre-med committee can actually give you a really incredible advantage. Pre-med committees also have a few other advantages, but in my opinion, they have an equal number of disadvantages. But I wouldn't, if your school has a committee and it's the school you really want, then don't let what I'm saying stop you from choosing that college. But you need to call me after you start school and let me tell you how to navigate the politics of that committee so that you actually get the advantages of that committee and none of the disadvantages. If you know what you're doing in advance, pre-health advising, on the other hand, is very similar to, say, the difference between working with Jason and working with your high school counselor, right? So your high school counselor is an important part of the process, right? And you can't cut them out. Working with Jason doesn't mean that your high school counselor no longer matters. They still have to submit certain things on your behalf. They can still give you certain advice that Jason, using data Jason may not have access to, but they are not nearly as hands-on as a pre-med committee, and they're not required to be part of the process. One of the things about a committee is if you go to a college that has a pre-med committee and you don't use the committee to apply to medical school, there's immediately a red flag raised. Why didn't it use the committee? Because committees will disqualify you if you don't jump through all of the hurdles. And you could have a perfect GPA and a perfect MCAT score, but because you missed a deadline by 5 minutes, you're disqualified. And so now you have to write, and when I say 5 minutes, I'm not exaggerating. And so when it comes time to apply to med school and you don't have a committee letter, then you have to write a whole essay about how you missed the deadline by 5 minutes. How does that make you look? Got it? So, but whereas pre-health advising is not, you don't have to use them, and a lot of my students don't use them. I kind of feel like I'm coming on too strong about the committee thing. I personally have seen many clients sort of burned by committees, and they've left a bad taste in my mouth, but don't let me overly influence you. Committees can be a fantastic part of your application. Just follow the rules to the letter. Okay. Now, next question. Does the college have a platform that connects students to research opportunities? Some do, some don't. You might just type the name of the school and then research opportunities. By platform, I literally mean like a web service. Like, think of like an app that helps students at a certain university connect to researchers within that same university, right? Like Brown has a great app like that. Hamilton doesn't have an app like that. I'm sorry, Colgate doesn't have an app like that. Hamilton does. Another thing, does the college have a shadowing program or a pre-med scholar program? These programs, if you're not in these programs, it doesn't matter at all. Med schools do not disadvantage you if you're not in a program. But a pre-med scholar program, which is sort of like an honors college, right? That can sort of hand some of this stuff to you on a silver platter. But you often have to apply to these things in your freshman year, often in your first semester of your freshman year. So be on the lookout for that right away, or even before you choose whether to go to school. Now, next, if study abroad is important to you, then find out if the college has a science-based study abroad program. That could easily be a tiebreaker for which college to go to. The problem with study abroad when you're a pre-med is that there is, and my advising service, I have you work, we do an Excel spreadsheet where we map out exactly what you're taking every semester of college, or what category of things you're taking every semester of college, because you have to plan that far in advance. And if you're doing study abroad, most study abroad programs are full of classes like, Italian culture, Italian language, art history, exploring the medieval, period of Europe or something, right? These are not biochem or physics with lab, right? So it can be very hard to study abroad and stay on the sort of pre-med timeline. So some universities, in response to that, have actually built a science-based study abroad so that you can go to Barcelona, do shadowing, study physics or whatever, right? And while you're doing all the other cool study abroad things. And then, and it needs to be based in the college generally, because if you, let's say your college allowed you to study physics at Salamanca University, that doesn't, they might allow that class to satisfy a graduation requirement, but the medical school admissions committee is not going to allow that class to satisfy a pre-med prereq unless that class is officially graded and accepted as a full credit by your US-based university. So you've got to be very careful that you don't accidentally take a class that you have to retake because you took it at the wrong place. But I'm a huge fan of study abroad. I think everybody should do it if they're remotely interested. Now, also, this is probably my second biggest piece of advice. Does the college grade intro level classes on a curve? And by intro level classes, I mean those ones on that other slide: Gen Chem, Orgo, biology, physics. I'm going to name a school by name, and I hope I don't get in trouble for doing this, but Cornell University. And another one, Berkeley. I would never recommend that a student go to Cornell as a pre-med. My business, my advising business is practically supported by really freaked out, upset Cornell people who were told that Cornell is one of the best pre-med schools to go to. And then were shocked when they found out how hard it is to be a pre-med there for a lot of reasons. One, Cornell has one of the most devious pre-med committees. Like, they will do things like send you an email on January 10th that if you don't complete this 30-page document by January 15th, then you are disqualified, right? And they will do, and the classes are graded on a curve. So you can make a 95 in a class and still make a C because 15% of the class made a perfect score, right? Berkeley, oh my God, I had a poor kid one time. He had never made below a 93 on a single class in his entire college education, and he had a 3.0 GPA, all right? Because of the intensity of the grading on a curve. So you might want to ask, especially at the really big schools, okay? Is Bio 101 graded on a curve, all right? Because I would rather you make an A. I would rather you go to, you know, Westchester and make a 4.0 than go to Penn and make a 3.4. Seriously, where you go to college is less important than your GPA. Speaking broadly, all right? There's a computer that controls the process at the beginning, and the computer can't tell the difference between Westchester and Penn. And you can get filtered out with your 3.4. Now, finally, how big are the intro level classes? This is especially important if you're not a science major. If you are the kid who wants to study classics or history or philosophy, well, your science classes are most of your science coursework is going to be the pre-med prereqs, which are often also these big, huge courses. And so those are your primary opportunities to get recs. And if you're in a 500-person class, you can't make a connection to the professor, and it's one of the only classes you're taking where you can get a teacher rec. That can be a problem. All right. So you have to be proactive and aggressive from the beginning. All right. Finally, how can you land successfully once you begin college? All right. Well, first off, have a happy, healthy college experience. Okay. You should find your footing freshman year, take Bio 101, probably also take Gen Chem 101, but then make sure you take an English class and like some sort of really simple distribution requirement. Like, don't overdo it. When I start with pre-med, with medical students coming to work with me on their med school apps, especially when they come to me as, you know, juniors or even seniors, so many times I see a really bad freshman year relatively because they just bit off way more than they could chew. You got to give yourself a chance to get used to being independent, to being out of the house, to, you know, college is not high school, even if you went to a rigorous high school and did very well. And you need to balance those two really hard pre-med classes with two classes that are simple. And the science classes are more important than the non-science classes, you know, when it comes to your GPA. So ask for help if you need it, all that. Also, talk to upperclassmen pre-meds about their pre-health advising process. Because the pre-health advising and at college, no matter what the materials say, no matter what the brochures say, no matter what the websites say, and no matter what the regional rep says to you, across the board, whether you're at an Ivy or whether you're at a local small college, the pre-health advising is not great. Okay. And it's sort of full of these sort of quick turnaround or blink and you'll miss it emails. I had a girl at University of Maryland who got disqualified from her committee packet because they only sent one email once, and it happened to be while she was on winter break. She missed the email until after this thing she was required to attend and disqualified a letter. They didn't send a reminder email. They sent one email. Oh, and it went to her spam, by the way. And when I told her to look for it, she found it it's just horrible, right? So if you talk to upperclassmen, they can warn you about things like that. I can also warn you about things like that. Like I like to work with people, you know, early in their experience, so I can help you avoid those sorts of really innocent rookie mistakes. Okay. And study abroad if you can, but as I've said, figure this out. If your advisor, and finally, if your college has a committee as opposed to advising, as we've discussed, understand exactly what their timeline is and what they expect of you. And then finally, apply. My little personal advice, apply at the end of senior year. Traditionally, people apply at the end of junior year and go straight from medical school, go straight from college to medical school. That is increasingly not the way it's done. Ooh, I'm looking at the time. I want to have time for questions. That's not the way it's done anymore. And you can go into something called the MSAR and see that the average age of students is getting older and older and older and older every year. And there's so much you have to do. And so many of my students, they start college assuming they're applying end of junior year. And by the end of freshman or sophomore year, they realize, oh, why am I trying to do this? And they change it. But if they had just done that from the beginning, it would have changed the whole way they planned out and strategized their college experience. So that's a little pro tip. Don't put that pressure on yourself. And now let's go back to those wrong questions that I posed at the beginning. Now you should have a better understanding about why these aren't the right questions to ask. Where can I find a list of strong pre-med programs? There's no such thing. That's just marketing. Any college you go to can potentially be a really great choice for you. So think about who you are, what you want to be around, you know, all of these other things. Is X a good school for pre-med? There's no such thing as a bad school for pre-med. If there's such thing as a bad student in pre-med, a student who didn't do the homework, who didn't understand the process, but medical schools are not really, they're not really looking at like where you went to college as a major factor in admissions. They're looking at what you did while you were in college. Then what should my pre-med student major in? We've talked about that. Doesn't really matter. Okay, as long as you hit those prereqs. And then finally, this school doesn't have good admission statistics for medical schools. Well, as I've now explained, and this is the job of the committee, medical schools can manipulate those, I'm sorry, colleges can manipulate those statistics in any way they want. And at Cornell, for example, if you factored in all the kids who got disqualified for the Cornell only counts kids who got a committee letter. Right? So when they say 98% of Cornell kids got accepted, that's actually 98% of kids who got a committee letter. And if you factor in all the kids who didn't get a committee letter, Cornell's pre-med admissions statistics just looked like most every other college, right? Sorry to pick on Cornell, but I do have a little bit of a beef with the way they handle some of this stuff. Now, finally, about that last question, as I said, they manipulate their statistics. And just last year, I had a girl go to Cal State San Luis Obispo in California, which is not a very selective university. She got a 3.99 GPA there, did everything right, and got into UCSF, which is a medical school, which is at the level of like Harvard and Stanford. All right. So guess what? Going to San Luis Obispo did not hurt her at all, because as I said, how she did in college is what mattered. All right. Now, on that note, I'm going to stop sharing because I really want to have time to answer any questions you might have.
First, before we turn over to questions, thank you so much. That's tremendous information that people, I just think you don't have access to. Super insightful, and just even how you know the Institute. So thank you very much, David. I learned, many great thoughts on it, and just always learning and insightful. So thank you.